And we went to the Nature Summit in at Drake University, the third annual, and it's scheduled again for next year in November. I think it's like the 19th or so. But if you go to Nature Summit, there's a website. I'll put you on there. I have great speakers for 2 days, great food, great time for like-minded people to be together on a variety of topics from cancer and farming and wildlife and education, legislators that are there that speak. It's really pretty good. We had an opportunity to hear Curt Meine, who's our guest speaker tonight, speak on his land about his um, new book, We Can Do Better, which is a great read. It's about the life and the events or the impact of Paul Johnson. Maybe many of you've maybe met him or know him from Iowa, as at one point time head of the Iowa DNR and his work with the NRCS and down in Washington D.C. And so it's a really good book to read. And so Paul comes to us from Wisconsin, Sauk City, in that area, and he does writes a lot of books. He wrote the first one on Aldo Leopold. I would call him probably an expert on that. He's on the board for the Aldo Leopold Center up there, and he's gonna like share stories about conservation and people and maybe what we can do. Um, and share his thoughts on water quality. In the last Nature Summit, that was the focus was on our waters and what we need to do. So I'm gonna let it just not go on, ramble too much here about that, Curt, but I'll let you, if I miss things or need to be corrected, you go right ahead and we'll invite Curt Meine to join us as our speaker. And if you have comments or questions, you can put them in the chat down below and we'll get to those later. I think when Candace gets back, she's working with her provost at the college right now. Will be with us in a second, but go ahead. So, Curt, take it away, buddy.
All right.
Fellow cheesehead, by the way. So, yeah.
Well, you know, we welcome you from across the river to come anytime and to buy our cheese, come see the cranes, come visit the Leopold Foundation, come up the Wisconsin River to where I live along the bluffs of the Driftless area. So happy to be here with you all, and thank you all for making time in your evening. Um, yes, I'll keep an eye on the chat. If anyone pops in with a question, I'm more than happy to answer. I hope you all can hear me fine. I'm working with a new computer, which so far seems to be flawlessly working, but knocking on wood right there. Okay. Well, thank you again for inviting me. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. Thank you for caring enough again to spend a little bit of time to talk about Paul Johnson. But kind of my focus, I thought I would bring tonight is uh, the influence of other Iowan, Aldo Leopold, on Paul, and how that really informed so much of what Paul did both statewide in Iowa and nationally when he rose to national prominence. And I'm going to actually start by, first of all, asking if I can go back to my gallery view here. Some of you are showing yourselves, others not, but I'm just curious how many folks looking at my screen here today might have known or met or had a chance to hear Paul Johnson sometime when he was giving a talk. Anyone who wants to put their hands up or say, put up the little thingy on your thing, a few of you at least. I see a few heads nodding there. So for some of you, Paul will be a well-known figure, maybe even someone you knew quite well. For others, maybe less so. And so I'll talk a lot about Paul tonight, but also I'll share with folks, again, this really important connection he had with Leopold and how that really shaped him. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And if all's working well, you should see a title slide here. Um, and the cover of the new book. So I'll start off by saying Paul was a dear friend, colleague, mentor to me. And when he passed away in February of 2021, um, this chore of collecting together his writings is something I, in the back of my mind, began to think about. And then talking with Paul's family and friends, I began to get more serious about it. And to make a long story short, it was really continuing a conversation that Paul and I had while he was alive. Paul, as I often will say, he didn't think of himself as a writer, but he wrote a lot. And as a public official, he put a real premium on communication with his constituents, with his employees, with the general public, with everyone. And so he left a paper trail, and I worked to collect that together in the new book. And you may order it. It was published by Ice Cube Press over in Iowa City. And here's the website. You can just Google, the title of the book and Ice Cube, and you'll get to it. But I make a special point of mentioning that our good friend Steve Semkin, the publisher, has offered you all a discount. If you would like to order it, you go to the Ice Cube website there and the book, and you can get a discount by putting in a code. The code is better 10 with a capital B, better 10. And you can order the book, and Steve says he'd be happy to give you a discount and ship you a copy. And I'll repeat that at the end for anyone who missed it. So, yeah, Paul and I spent a lot of time talking over our 40-year friendship. And a lot of that relationship and connection with Paul came through his appreciation of the legacy of Aldo Leopold. I took these, I matched paired up these two photos so you could see both Leopold and Paul in their writing mode here, almost in the exact same stance when I put these two pictures together. Leopold up at his shack here in Wisconsin, and Paul actually up at sort of his shack up in the Boundary Waters, I guess was what his family told me, where that picture was taken in his later years. And when we look back at the legacies of these two conservation leaders, we see a lot of interesting parallels and connections. I'll just use a few quotes from both Paul and Leopold. But this is, most of you, I'm going to guess, are pretty familiar with Aldo Leopold and probably have read his Sand County Almanac or pieces of it from time to time. But here's Aldo Leopold in his very well-known essay, The Land Ethic, talking about the role of private landowners, and I'll talk more about this in the course of the talk here, but here's Leopold. There's a clear tendency to relegate to government all jobs that private landowners fail to perform. But at one point, will government conservation, like a mastodon, become handicapped by its own dimensions? The answer, if there is any, seems to be a land ethic or some other force that assigns more obligation to the private landowner. So Leopold, especially in the second half of his career, was really focused on how do we work together as a whole community to encourage better land use among private land owners, and in the Midwest, especially, of course, our farmers. Well, Paul shared that same passion for thinking about private land and conservation. So when he was chief of the NRCS, I'll go into more detail on this later on, he publishes this report, writes the introduction to it. And he's making a point here about sort of the relative neglect of conservation on private lands. We've been so focused on public lands in this country in the history of conservation. But being from Iowa, he was particularly interested in raising the profile of private land conservation, saying here, we understand that narrowly circumscribed areas of natural beauty, protected land alone can't provide the quality environment people need and want. We must also recognize the needs of America's private landowners to have a true geography of hope. This particular interest in conservation in the role of the private landowner is something that Paul carried the torch sort of forward with in the 90s. I'll put that into context later on here. But I also want to make the point. I didn't plan to do this, but you can find these interesting parallel images. There's Leopold on the right with his wife Estella, and Paul on the left. I think that must be with his daughter. It looks like Annika, maybe. Both of them planting conifers, Aldo planting pines and Paul planting Christmas trees on his farm up near Decorah. So, as much as they were interested in ideas and in policy and in science, they are also two figures who had their hands literally in the dirt in their careers. And interestingly, both of them had early professional experiences in the U.S. Forest Service out west. Leopold down in New Mexico and Arizona. Paul, one of his early jobs in his career was a summer spent working with the Forest Service out in Oregon. So they were both also devoted to public service, working in the agencies and with the agencies in the conservation arena. So most of this talk, I'm going to follow Paul's trail. I'll take a couple detours into Leopold a little more too, and I'll want to keep in mind, Tom, you said about the current issues and how this all relates. So, especially when we have time for discussion, maybe we can explore that a little more. But I'll do a quick biography of Paul for those of you who knew him and those who didn't. But another thing that he and Leopold share, they were both Midwesterners, born and bred. In Paul's case, he was born in Oakland, but as a young man, moved to be near family in South Dakota and then outside Chicago. Spent a little time in Wisconsin, even. Paul moved around a lot, but he did eventually graduate from high school in the suburbs of Chicago. But he had a lot of experience under his belt already on working on farms, particularly in South Dakota. He went to college at the University of Illinois. And this is a funny photo. He's on the right there. Paul's early interest wasn't really closely related to conservation. He was into aviation. That was his early professional kind of aspiration. And went to work at the airport in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. Why do I use this as a launching point? Because in many ways, we can track Paul's commitment to public service to this airport. How's that? Well, first of all, it is an airport, a public facility, but also when he was there as a young 19-year-old student working at the airport, he brought in the plane that carried John F. Kennedy in the campaign in 1960. The presidential campaign was afoot, and Kennedy and his entourage landed at the airport. And Paul described meeting him, as well as people like Sergeant Shriver and Stuart Udall, all on the same plane. Kennedy went off to give this big speech at the campus in Champaign. But this was an inflection point in Paul's early trajectory. And within a year, he's joined the Peace Corps. He's one of the early Peace Corps volunteers. Actually, Paul's future wife, Pat, who you'll meet in a minute, was in the very first cohort of volunteers in the Peace Corps. Paul was, I think, in the second year of Peace Corps volunteers, going to work in Western Africa, in Ghana. And it was that experience, however, that began to shift his focus. He became more and more interested in forestry, and that became the focus of his early career and his going on to graduate school in Michigan, where he went to study forestry and forest ecology with this fellow. You won't know his name probably, but the fellow in the middle there was one of the most important early forest ecologists, published one of the very first textbook in the field. So Paul was already oriented to the field of forestry, but particularly with an understanding of not just timber management, but the ecology of whole forests. And in his own research, Paul went on to do work in tropical forest ecology in Costa Rica. He returned to Ghana later on, but it was while he was in grad school that he did in Ann Arbor, where he did meet, court, and eventually marry his wife, Pat, who some of you may know. She's alive and well in Decorah. And again, he returns to West Africa. So he's getting a lot of world experience in this new field for him of forest and community forestry. And so Paul is on track for an academic life and career. He's all but done with his PhD. He's been doing research in tropical forests. But then he makes another big change and makes a major shift in his and Pat's life when they decide to uproot and move to Decorah, Iowa, and buy a farm. And it's something of a mystery. Paul was so close to finishing his PhD, but like a lot of younger people back in the 60s and early 70s, they were part of the movement of getting back to the land, right? Of finding ways to directly work on land. And so Paul becomes a farmer. He's a dairy farmer, milking his jerseys. And Pat goes to work up at Luther College in Dubuque, and that's the life they begin and with their growing family. He was not a public figure at that point. He was taking care of kids and milking cows. But come 1983 or 84, he is elected to the Iowa House of Representatives, having not had a elected position before that. And if, again, you're Iowan, so put yourself back. What was happening in Iowa in 1984, 1985? Most of you can answer that question. It was the depths of the farm crisis, which was making national news. It was not just an Iowa problem, but Iowa was, by most accounts, the epicenter of the crisis in the farming economy and communities across the country, but again in Iowa, even more amplified. And so Paul takes office in early 1985 in Des Moines. And this is the very first issue on his plate. And in fact, it's the very first thing in the book of his writings that I collected is of him writing to his constituents back in Northeast Iowa about actions that he and others were taking to try to address this profound crisis in our farming communities. But he also was into a lot of other issues, and it soon became apparent there were other crises, including crises of water contamination. And I mention this because this would become Paul's hallmark issue, not just water quality, but environmental and conservation issues in general. But it was the groundwater issues that really grabbed his attention first. And it was through his leadership that Iowa's legislature passed, and the governor, Branstad, at that time in his early career, signed the Groundwater Protection Act. That was a landmark not only for Iowa, but this was a law without precedent really nationally, as far as I can tell. The Groundwater Act did a lot of things that you all in Iowa have benefited now for quite a long while, for almost 40 years. It included all kinds of new provisions for regulating storage tanks and abandoned wells and such, for addressing well issues, for public education on groundwater, which most people don't really have much of an understanding of, especially back then. Research, you'll see in my talk here about his commitment to fostering research that can help inform our policies. And so you'll see right on the screen here, he made a point of distributing the research responsibilities to 3 public universities of Iowa. And especially the one that became probably the marquee contribution of the Groundwater Act was the establishing of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State in 1987. When you go back and look at the Groundwater Act, a few things stand out for the reader. One of them is in this last sentence here. Paul saw it not just as a policy issue, but really as an ethical issue. So this is from one of his writings in the book. The uniqueness of the Groundwater Act lies in calling upon all Iowans to develop a conservation ethic through a host of programs in research, education, and demonstration. You see this theme of not just passing a law, but encouraging an ethic coursing through Paul's career. So this is detour number 1. With his invoking of a conservation ethic and establishing the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. That brings us back to Leopold. And so I'm going to just say a few words about Leopold at the moment. Sorry, I mean, my phone is going off in the background here. Um, Turns out that 1986, as that bill was being prepared, in fact, Iowa State was hosting a centennial celebration of Aldo Leopold's birth. Some of you, maybe most of you, know that Aldo Leopold was born in Burlington, Iowa. That was not much appreciated back then because Leopold was always associated with his place here in Wisconsin. But the Iowans grabbed it, and folks at Iowa State organized the centennial gathering, which I, as a young student, actually attended and gave some of my very first public talks. Out of that came the book on the right, by the way, still available from the Soil and Water Conservation Society. So, just a few words about Leopold. Um, Aldo Leopold contributed in so many different areas of conservation that he's really unique in our history in American conservation. So we think of him as a pioneer in wildlife ecology and management. His work in protecting wilderness areas, including the first one in New Mexico, the Gila Wilderness. He was active in education. He was a researcher and a scientist. He was a writer. But one aspect of Leopold's work that had been almost overlooked and forgotten by the time of the centennial gathering was his contributions to agriculture and the intersection of conservation and agriculture. And in fact, one of those talks I gave at that conference back then in 1986 was on that very theme of Leopold and conservation and agriculture. And to go back and look through Leopold's record, you can find him writing voluminously about especially wildlife on the farm, but also about problems like soil erosion, and about the importance of being aware of one's watershed, right? Leopold had a fascination with watersheds from his work in the Forest Service. Later on, after he came back to Wisconsin, this is on the left, is a publication he did within the Forest Service. On the right, an article of his about another watershed he became connected with, the Coon Creek watershed, which is just outside La Crosse, Wisconsin. And Coon Valley was a critically important episode, not only in Leopold's life, but in the history of conservation, because it was the site of the first watershed scale restoration project in the country. And Leopold was involved in that as a researcher and planner. In the late 30s, Aldo Leopold published this essay called The Farmer as a Conservationist. This is a gem. It was published, was a speech first, and then it was later published in a journal. But it's one of those forgotten gems. It had not been republished since 1939 until 1991. And I remember reading this and just kind of being blown away by it. But I pulled out two lines from this because these are sentences that Paul Johnson would weave into his own speeches, and especially the last 15 or 20 years of his life. He was constantly referring to this particular essay, in which Leopold writes of the landscape of any farm as the owner's portrait of himself. That the individual farmer who weaves the greater part of the rug on which America stands. Paul loved that line. Shall he weave into it only the sober yarns that warm the feet, or also some of the colors which warm the heart and eye? So Paul, in his public career, he had just become connected with this legacy of Leopold in Iowa and in the Midwest, and brought that to his creation of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. A couple other key point highlights from Paul's career in the legislature was something you're probably very familiar with, the Resource Enhancement and Protection Act, REAP, which has continued to fund good work all across Iowa for decades now. And finally, I'll mention just another, there's a lot more, of course, one could go through, but also the Energy Act, one of the first statewide efforts to encourage greater efficiency in energy use. So put yourself back in these years. I can remember them. I was beginning my career, but Iowa was already on the map in many ways because of its movement towards sustainable agriculture that really emerged from the farm crisis. Many of you are familiar, of course, with Practical Farmers of Iowa. They emerge at this point. And the reason I'm using this slide is because it's a moment when that term sustainability, which we're all familiar with now, it was still kind of not even acceptable. It was still fuzzy, and nobody quite knew what it was supposed to mean. But in Iowa, because of this crisis and of the response to it, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, it began to put meat on the bones of that term. It began to give it grounding and practical meaning. And Paul was now a national figure for this work. Through the work in Iowa, and especially through that Groundwater Act, Paul was now and it wasn't just him alone. Of course, I should quickly add that there were some amazing legislators in those days, and I've gotten to know a number of them, and you would know them too, who helped to do all this. But Paul's national prominence leads to him getting involved with other efforts around the country and in Washington, D.C. He joins the Board on Agriculture of the National Academy of Sciences. And so Paul's interest in research, again, allows him to take this position, which he was the first farmer to be on the Board on Agriculture at the National Academy. Amazing. And through that office, a series of reports that allowed the word sustainability then to become used. I could go on stories on this personally because I went to work. Actually, I worked on 3 of those reports early in my career, and that's how I began to interact with Paul. Although I'd met him before, began to interact with him more regularly through that years we crossed trails in Washington. And that work in turn led to Paul becoming named chief of what was then the Soil Conservation Service. And I love this quote from one of the government, kind of inside government journals, when Paul Johnson, former state legislator and folk hero of the sustainable agriculture movement, became chief of the Soil Conservation Service. He didn't have to travel far to learn why this once venerated agency was in deep trouble with the farmers it served. All he had to do was listen to his neighbors. Again, Paul's field credibility as a farmer was carrying him well into this office. Now, here's our second detour. Just to go back to a little history, I've been doing versions of this talk with students, and so I always like to bring in a little bit of basic history for students who may not be aware of kind of these shoulders we all stand on. The Soil Conservation Service, formed in 1935, was really the product of this man's passion for soil conservation, Hugh Hammond Bennett, one of the leading soil scientists in the world, and then one of the leading policymakers too, as he was in public service. This 1928 report on the right was a landmark in beginning to address the crisis of soil erosion that would, of course, become internationally known through the crisis of the Dust Bowl years. The Dust Bowl years led to the creation of the Soil Conservation Service and a reorientation in conservation. This is Aldo Leopold writing here. In the Midwest, in our part of the upper Mississippi River, the problem was not this so much as it was gully erosion. And so in this place, which is right near the Coon Valley watershed that I mentioned earlier, Leopold, toward the end of the 1930s, writes, "We end at what might be called the standard paradox of the 20th century. Our tools are better than we are and grow better faster than we do. Suffice to crack the atom, command tides, but they don't suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it." So that was the mission of the Soil Conservation Service. This is that same area of western Wisconsin now, right? The work of soil conservationists over now generations and decades has created landscapes like this. This is from the Driftless area, so those of you who know Northeast Iowa will recognize the patterns on the land like this. And the soil, what was first called the Soil Erosion Service, becomes the Soil Conservation Service. And under Paul Johnson's time as chief, it becomes the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That name change happened while Paul was chief. Um, these are just a few of the highlights of Paul's 4 years of work in the NRCS. Anyone who's really interested in the deep dive here, I'll be doing actually another webinar talk on the 20th of January um, that will really focus on Paul's years within the NRCS. But he spent 4 years there, and the agency went through tremendous changes. It became much more modern in so many ways through technology, through the changes in the workforce, through an expanded vision for the agency beyond just soil conservation to all the other things it actually had been doing all along, but now including attention to wildlife and biodiversity, and even then to climate change. And outside the agency, Paul was really gifted at bringing the agency into partnership with other agencies like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he, especially in his role as a public figure, stressed education. He was so passionate about teaching citizens the importance of this agency that had been almost overlooked, especially by urban audiences. Paul's joke in these years was, yeah, I'm the chief of the SCS, the Secret Conservation Service, because urban audiences didn't really know much about it. And so Paul becomes, through all of that, just a champion of this concept of needing to do more work on private lands conservation. This is the document that really captured that. Paul assigned his staff to preparing a report that could be read by anybody that would talk about the significance of paying attention to private lands. It's 70% of the nation's land base. But even many of the prominent environmental organizations did not pay it much attention. So Paul turned his staff loose, and this is some of them. And the story here is that Paul, he liked to do this. He did this a few times in his career where he says, we got to get out of our offices. And we got to get to places where we can think. So he decamped. He took his entire senior staff and came off to Wisconsin and asked my colleagues if they could use the Leopold shack for their meeting space while they were preparing this report. And so I think they spent 2 or 3 days, and it's pretty hot and humid and mosquito-y in the summer along the Wisconsin River. But they came up with the concept of this report, and it became a really important, one of the most important, I think, reports ever published by the government. Here's just a sample from it. You can again find this in the new book. As we use our land, here's him using Leopold's line, right? We paint our individual and community portraits on the land. Done well, those portraits can be a source of pride. Private land need not be devoted to single purpose enterprise. The broad understanding of land and our place in the landscape, our farms, ranches, and private forests can and do serve the multiple functions that we and all other life depend upon. So this becomes almost a mission statement for this agency as it moves to meet the growing connected challenges of conservation in our century. It gained a lot of attention and support. He had copies sent to every member of Congress. And then Paul, after that, he finished off. He stayed on longer than he was anticipating. He was badly missing his life back in Decorah, but he did stay on for about another year beyond what he expected. And when he did leave the federal government, you can see the statement of Senator Harkin upon Paul's departure. And even Harkin got this. Harkin understood that he says Paul brought to NRCS a bold vision of private lands as a national treasure. So Paul retires back to Iowa, but not for long. He gets called into service again by Governor Vilsack to serve as the Department of Natural Resources Director. It was not a long term. Paul was running into dead ends and political blocks that were really driving him kind of crazy, actually. But he did his best within the couple years he was given to work with the DNR. And he said he wasn't going to do this anymore, but he did. He tried one more time. He ran for Congress in 2004, feeling that, especially at that point, there was a real need for fresh leadership. He did not win this race, but he really entered it wanting to start conversations that he felt needed to be had. And look at that District 4. I'm looking at it now. I hadn't looked at that in quite a while, but I think the maps of Iowa are less gerrymandered now than they were back then. We're getting into Paul's later years, and I'll make the connections again with the Leopold tradition. Paul joined our board at the Aldo Leopold Foundation in 2003 or 4, somewhere in there. So here's Aldo Leopold's children, Estella on the left and Carl Leopold on the right, with Paul at one of those board meetings. And maybe it was the generous potluck dinners there that made them productive and happy board members. And in his later years, Paul was enjoying his life greatly back on the farm in Decorah and the cabin up in the Boundary Waters, his growing, expanding family with his 6 granddaughters. And it was in these years that Paul really began to write a little more consciously. So the last part of the book, you'll see a few essays in which he's a little more reflective about this. So he's thinking in a different way about writing, not just as a public official sharing information, but as someone who's really deeply informed on the history of conservation, on the science of the challenges we face, and on the changing culture of conservation and the changing culture of this country. So there's a lot of anguish in these later years as Paul sees us drifting in ways that worked against what he had worked for so long. I thought I would just choose a couple quotes because I'm not reading much from the book, but I'll choose a couple short passages to illustrate a couple of the themes that he was really devoted to. First one, I mentioned research a few times. He was just so passionate about, maybe it was his own background as a forester and a research scientist. But here's him speaking. The purpose of research at our universities isn't simply to produce more jobs. It's more than that. More than ever, our research should be allowed to focus on public as well as private concerns. And I only need to mention issues like surface water quality to make a point here, right? You and I are dealing with your own current crisis of water quality and public health. And we need ever more information to help us make the right choices. That was Paul's bottom line in many ways. Or think of how Paul talked about the need to think about diversity in the farm landscape. And as the trends have forced Iowa more and more into just corn and soybeans, as he says here, Iowa farmers could proudly show the world they can contribute to reducing climate change while serving multiple functions rather than just growing corn and soybeans. I believe no agriculture is sustainable if it ignores the health of the natural ecosystem where it operates. So in his later years, you see a lot of emphasis on encouraging new ways of thinking about farming that fit with our conservation goals. And then again, this theme of private land conservation. He returned again and again and again to this and made a plea for us to come together to think about what we can do in official ways through the legal system and through legislation, but also through the ethics. Private land conservation deserves an elevated position within mainstream conservation and environmentalism. And a societal commitment separate and distinct from its current position as a stepchild within agribusiness-dominated farm policy. So those of you who know the Farm Bill and follow the Farm Bill, I think he's really referring to that here. He's talking about how it's always kind of the, as he says here, the stepchild within the Farm Bill discussions. So this is the last slide I'm going to have. I took this photo. Paul must have been, boy, I have to go back and look, but I imagine this would have been the summer of 2019, the year before he passed or so, with his son Eric at the Leopold shack. He really wanted to take another visit back to the shack and wanted Eric to see it. You can see Paul there is with kind of hobbled at this point. He had had a terrible near fatal tractor accident in 2012. And so he was left hobbled and his health compromised for the rest of his life, but his spirit was unwavering. I thought I would use this last slide and just read you one last piece, and then we can hopefully have some time for conversation. This comes at the end of actually a off the cuff speech Paul gave. It's called The Iowa Land Ethic. And it was actually, again, sort of an extemporaneous set of remarks he gave in 2013. And it was for the Iowa Environmental Council at Drake University. And I'm just going to read you the last couple paragraphs of this. Hopefully, that'll set us up for having some conversation. Iowa gave us something nobody thought would ever happen, a movement to protect wilderness lands in this country. And what he's talking about there are some of the other great Iowans who contributed disproportionately to conservation and particularly wilderness protection. And he's thinking right there, Wallace Stegner, who was born in Lake Mills, and Ernest Oberholzer. Those are the two he's referring to. We are better positioned than anybody in the world today to create an agriculture that this world's going to need. It isn't only about feeding 6 billion and then 10 billion and then 15 billion. That's part of it. But what's even more important is a world that also supports the wide array of life that we've been so blessed with. I'd like to close, he said to his audience, as I always do, with Aldo Leopold and the land ethic. This is the idea that the only way we're going to get there is that each of us understands what land is. Land in the larger sense, not just the sand, silts, and clays, but the soil, water, air, wildlife, the plants and animals, and people, and how we can all come together on that land and how we can care for it. Leopold felt that you can pass all the rules you want and you still won't get there. Take all the voluntary measures you want and you won't get there. We need both, but even more than that, we need the hearts of people who love land and understand land. That's where we really have to go in the end. And that's a lot larger and more difficult task than developing a nutrient reduction strategy, isn't it? That last line is a little bit of a dig, because by then the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture was being threatened even then. And this was one of Paul's special legacies. It would take another several years for the Iowa State Legislature to defund the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, but Paul was passionate about all these questions and needs in everything he did and said. And so I'm going to stop there. If you have questions in particular about the book or about Paul or Leopold or their connection or anything else, and particularly, again, the current issues that you're all facing, let's have a chat. Now I'm going to have some tea too. I'm dried out. Let's see.
So, yeah. I said one thing, Curt, before we go farther, and I kind of lost my notes when I was introducing you, and you were talking about your life, and I just want to mention to people um, what you did in your life. You're a conservation biologist and environmental historian and writer, as we've found out. He also serves as a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and with the Chicago-based Center for Humans and Nature. And he's also a research associate with the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo that many of us have been to, and I guess has been rebuilt, an associate adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. So there's a lot of background and experience there too, and so that might help you get an idea of maybe how to formulate some questions or some conversation as we move along.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for all the extra info.
Yeah.
And I do want to mention, I noticed, I don't know if he's still here, but I did see Larry Stone popping up on my screen here at one
Ah,
point. So
Mhm.
those of you who knew Paul or worked with Paul, I'd especially appreciate if you'd like to share anything about your experience that, have a different perspective maybe than I do. And if you're trying to speak, unmute yourself.
that's right.
Don't forget that one. Don't forget that
Right.
part.
Yeah, this is Larry Stone. Curt, am I unmuted?
I hear you, Larry. Good.
There we go.
Okay.
We hear you.
So I was uh, knew Paul several different ways, but I covered him when he was in the legislature a little bit, although I wasn't directly reporting on the legislature, but I was following that. Then when he became director of the Department of Natural Resources, I interacted with him there several times. Oh, uh, just because I knew him as a friend, and if I had a comment about something that was happening, I would talk to him, and he was usually pretty sympathetic. Then in let's see, 1999, I guess it was, I got the job of helping to write the book that Paul kind of wanted for the DNR, Iowa Portrait of the Land. And Paul chose the title of that because of his interest in the Leopold, the farmer, um, uh, the landscape of every man's land is a portrait of himself. And
Yep.
Paul, as you said, really emphasized that. So,
I
and
had to when I was editing the book, I had to trim some of the essays because he kept using that quote and one or two others over and over and over. So I didn't want it to get too repetitive for the reader.
yeah,
So I actually had to edit out a few of those just to make it a little more compact. Yeah. Thank you, Larry, for sharing that. Paul always worked through so many friends and colleagues who shared his vision, and so there's so many in Iowa that deserve every bit as much of the credit for that record. Yeah, I see a question there in the chat from Jane about education people about the land, where groups like Audubon included. Again, some of you may have some more experience with Paul than I do. I know that I had several occasions where Paul invited me over to speak to the Natural Heritage Group, to other groups in Iowa. The thing that comes to my mind, Jane, when looking at your question, is Paul was unusual among public figures that I've ever worked with in his appreciation of history. It really, really marked him as something different from the run of the mill agency head. He was devoted to the history, understood himself as following in the footsteps of others. And I'll say that included people who maybe disagreed with him. That was part of his approach to public service too, was to recognize that in a democracy we have to be able to work across our divisions. And I say that knowing now what a horrific time we are in on that theme. But Paul's passion for history and for sharing that history with citizens. So this is the education of all of us, rather than in the schools, for example. But that's the first thing that came to mind. Paul read widely, and you'll see him referencing all kinds of different writers and people from who writing about the history too. But I think he thought that was fundamental to the educational effort. And I'll say that that's something that I tried to do with this book. All of us, yeah. Well, I don't see everybody on the screen, but the ones I do see have shades of hair that are about as gray as mine, not quite in some cases, but I had younger people in mind with this book a lot. I wanted them to be able to read through Paul's experience and words what we have been through in the last 40 to 50 years in agriculture and conservation. I mentioned at the outset, the farm crisis of the 1980s. Many of you, no doubt, have personal stories about what was going on in farm country in the 1980s. Well, a lot of young people, they don't know there was a farm crisis. They don't know what that was. Well, it should be fundamental, shouldn't it? I think, anyway. And so this book, I hope, does an educational, uh, makes an educational contribution in that same way by sharing some of that history. And I can say it just did. I had a message today from a student in Madison that I gave a copy of the book to not long ago. And she was great. She wrote me this long email about how it really helped fill in a lot of gaps. So I encourage you, if you have a younger person in your circles who is interested in conservation and agriculture, to consider sharing this book with them. Maybe it'll be helpful to them.
I got thinking, Curt, if either Aldo Leopold or Johnson were back in time today, and as effective as they were as writers and Paul as the legislator, what would be one or two pieces of legislation with in today's climate that they would really push for that would help everybody if they could focus on a couple of things that could get passed that would and maybe something we could think about. Well, if we did this, would help a lot of people.
Yeah, well, there's what we can think that would be they would want to see happen and what would advance things. And then there's the political reality that we find ourselves in right now, where the divisions and polarization are so overwhelming. Both of them, so let's start from that point. Both of them had a conviction that if the more people, the better people understood land, our connections to it, the history of that land, including the difficult histories that we don't often want to look at, the better we will recognize our shared interest in the land, our common interest in the land. So, Paul, we can be pretty clear with Paul because he did write in the last 10 years, 15 years of his life, especially about the need for what he would call a private land conservation act that would lift conservation out of from the level of what usually gets passed in a farm bill to something more comprehensive, something more extensive, something more effective. So he did write about that, and that's become one of the missions of, I should have used my last slide there, of the Johnson Center. There's a nonprofit that the Johnson family and colleagues have set up called the Johnson Center for Land Stewardship Policy. And one of its hopes is to foster conversation about what a private land conservation act would look like. I'll speak to Iowa right now because you all are going to be in the spotlight again in this year as the election season comes on, and there is going to be, and there already is, and you're a part of it, a lot of discussion about water. And I've seen it when I've been over there in the last few months. We heard it at the Nature Summit in Des Moines. It seems to me as a non-Iowan that you're at another point where what you do in Iowa is going to have ripple effects, no pun intended, well beyond your state, because your surface water quality issues. I just read there was a headline just yesterday about in the midwinter having to crank up the nitrate removal stuff up in Des Moines, right? And I see heads nodding there. You know more about this than I do. Water is fundamental, and it should be the thing that we can come together around, right? Because water connects us all. Water is the fundamental connecting, medium for life, and it should be a basis for shared interest and concern and policy and laws. But instead, it's often become a point of division and contention. Well, we'll see if Iowa can rise to that and do for surface water what Paul and his colleagues did for groundwater in 1987, right? They made groundwater a visible issue And Paul was adamant about thinking of it in terms of our shared responsibility. So I'll be watching Iowa. I'll be over there more than a few more times talking about the book. But we'll be very eager to see how that conversation goes forward. I hope that kind of helps a little, Tom.
Curt,
Yeah.
Chris, I have a question for you. I was at the Nature Summit, so I've heard you speak twice now.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's good to be reinforced. I'm halfway through your book.
Paul's
and-
book.
Paul's book. Okay. Well, that's part of the thing is as I'm reading his essays and looking at the dates on them and everything, I'm sitting there and thinking, oh my gosh, this is really good writing and really good ideas. And now looking back and thinking, but this hasn't happened and this hasn't continued. And that's very disappointing, and wishing that he were still here and still able to do those things. What do you think he would think of what's happening now?
Mhm.
And do you think there's somebody else that could take that position? Maybe somebody like Chris Jones. Do you think he has a chance in this state?
Yeah, I don't know Iowa as well as obviously you all do. I keep my ears open, and I'm not that far. I'm pretty close actually to Iowa. So um, here's where my head goes on that comment. Paul was an unusual politician. He really was. He was, in fact, if you saw that brochure he did when he ran for Congress, he ran as he called it, an independent Democrat. He insisted on having that word independent in there. He was not a party animal. He left the legislature in part because he saw things getting more and more divisive, and he saw money becoming more important in political campaigns, and he just didn't want to be that. He also had a real record of doing his best to work across political ideologies and party lines. His daughter, Annika, loves to tell the story about as a little girl seeing him literally cross the aisle to speak with Republican counterparts in the legislature, literally going across the aisle to speak. One of my other favorite stories of Paul's political career, in his very first race for state legislature, he was running against a Republican who he knew. He'd known him for a long time. And he was an older gentleman who'd been in office for quite a while. I've forgotten his name. But Paul, one of the first things he did when he found himself on the ballot was call up his opponent, meet him for coffee, and tell him what he was going to say about his opponent during the campaign. I mean, who does that, right?
Yeah.
But Paul knew him, and it was just a matter of being decent and saying, that's how you want to behave. Well, that seems like an ancient history right now, right? But I think that there is a hunger out there for us to step away from the extreme rhetoric and the dynamics that we have found ourselves in now for the last decade. There's a real hunger for this. And yet it's become harder and harder to do. So I don't know if I'm optimistic one day and a little more pessimistic the next, but I do keep my ears open for people in the public arena who are willing to get up there and speak their truth and do it honestly. And even if you disagree with them, have keep the sense of being respectful. I've seen Chris Jones. Yeah, I know his book. I read his book. I read Swine Republic, published by the same publisher as this book, Ice Cube Press. So I've been watching that, and I just saw that he announced that he's running for Secretary of Agriculture. So we're going to see. I think that's again when I said that the eyes are going to be on Iowa. That's going to be an example of that. I know Rob Sand. I've seen his stuff a little bit, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. Turns out Rob Sand worked on that campaign of Paul Johnson's in 2004. Sand grew up in Iowa, I mean, in Decorah, and he, he must have been a kid. I don't know how old he is, but 22 years ago, he was working on Paul's campaign, and maybe there's a little bit of him in a little bit of Paul rubbing off there. I don't know. Um, but let's check in a few more months, right? Because you all are going to help shape that conversation for the rest of us. You all in Iowa are going to be really important in seeing if we can uh, do what Paul tried so hard to do, which is bring people together instead of divide us. And that to me is the hallmark of leadership, and especially in conservation, to focus on all those things that connect us rather than all those things that divide us.
That was beautifully said, Curt. Of
Right.
course, you are a wordsmith.
Yeah.
This is Candace. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. I loved the photos and how you juxtaposed the Aldo Leopold ones with Mr. Johnson. I'm curious, I'm a librarian by trade. Um, where are Aldo Leopold's um, papers held?
Yeah.
Is Are they at Iowa State or?
Okay, sure. I can answer that, Candace. First of all, thanks you for your work as a librarian. I say that these days because we know what heroes you are. Leopold's
Thank you.
extensive paper trail. The bulk of Aldo Leopold's archival records are, in fact, kept at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, in the basement of the agricultural library there. I lived there for about 4 years, underground. But the good news is any one of you can leave this Zoom and go click on and see the digitized version of Aldo Leopold's papers. The entire collection has been digitized and is available for free.
Wow.
And in fact, you'd be interested in this, Candace. It was one of the very first extensive archival collections to be digitized back more than 20 years ago now, through a special grant from the National Endowment for Humanities. And it's an incredible tool, an incredible collection. And it relates here in that when I was doing my research on Leopold many, many years ago now, I was the only one who could see those things. You had to be physically present. And so this amazing material that was produced by Leopold hadn't seen the light of day. Then, after I wrote my book, my biography of Leopold, we began to publish more and more of these other essays that people had not read or had not seen the light of day for decades. And it's powerful stuff. It's really, really interesting and deep. And Paul benefited from that when there was a collection published in 1991 that included that essay called The Farmer as a Conservationist. That's the book Paul read. That's the one that he then quoted from for the next 25 years. So the importance of keeping these records and these archival materials is just this is when the inner historian comes out again for me. And so yeah, anyone can go on, and I really encourage you to come visit the Aldo Leopold Foundation at some point if you find yourself coming across Wisconsin, and see some of the displays and other educational materials we have there.
Thanks for that information. I'm going to find the link and I will add the link to that Aldo Leopold collection to our website. And when you spoke of that essay that Leopold wrote, characterizing the farmer as conservationist, it brings to mind my father, who implemented the first no-till farming in our area back in I forget the decade, but back in Southeast Wyoming. And my dad and I would not agree on politics currently, but again, I was really proud of the fact that he was the first farmer in our county to implement no-till.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, let me say a word on that. That it's very easy to get discouraged right now, right, by the state of our political culture. But I've been involved in enough projects, and what you just said, Candace, really reminds me of this, that once you get people out on the ground, get them away from their phones and screens, get them talking to one another again, and talk about the shared land that we all live on, you amazingly find that most of us are aboard with one another. We all want to see healthy land. And you can look at the movement in agriculture around the concept of soil health over the last 20 years, especially. Soil health has become this kind of movement unto itself, bringing farmers, consumers, land managers of different kinds, young people, old people, farmers, non-farmers, consumers, it brings people together. Even in this political climate right now, we see discussions of soil health and coming out of the current administration. It's amazing. So even in this time of really troubling change, um, bringing people back to say, how can we work together to improve things for our soils and our waters, our plants and animals, for our rural communities and cultures? This is where the common ground is. And it will always be there if we decide that we want to go and work on it. So, and you have so many good people in Iowa doing that exactly. So, you know them better than I do, but that's the record of the practical farmers of Iowa. That's the work of Lisa Schulte Moore up at Iowa State doing prairie strips. It's the work of the people in Northeast Iowa trying to protect their beautiful driftless Iowa trout streams, on and on and on. So,
I found that you talk about positive things, that your photos of the Coon Valley when it was just a big gully as
yeah.
opposed to what it is now. You can't help but be inspired to look at that photo and see farming in progress and habitat and beauty, and that shows in itself just what has happened and can be
Yeah.
done and what other people are doing. And um,
Mm-hmm. Well, I encourage you again, if you should find yourself traveling up toward La Crosse, Wisconsin, just go in from the river on the other side, just 5 or 10 miles, and you'll come to the Coon Creek watershed. It's beautiful. It's just a beautiful part of the Midwest. And I'll just say one little bit about this. That Coon Valley project created a culture of conservation in that area. And for decades, it was able to sustain itself and keep these farms growing better and better every year. Um, but then we began to see the impacts of climate change on extreme rainfall in that area, starting really about 20 years ago. We've had a lot of awful flooding events, and it's in alignment with what we predict will happen with climate change and the increased incidence of these extreme rains. You've seen it in Iowa too, all across Iowa. So this is unprecedented. So even though that project is almost 90, getting up to 90 years ago, it faces new challenges. And the good news out of that, if they're the silver lining, is that there's a whole new generation of younger farmers and food producers and processors and restaurateurs and people buying stuff in their local markets, right? It really has. I was so impressed. I was out there a couple of years ago to give a little talk, and I was just so taken with this new wave of energy among younger people picking up the torch for the next generation. So we need to replicate that everywhere, everywhere. And if you're a trout fisherman, of course, I highly recommend Coon Creek. David, I see a hand up over there.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Coon River or Valley. Could you quickly explain what they did on the conservation plan that they had there?
Yeah, sure. So imagine a small watershed right along the Mississippi River, steep bluffs of the driftless area, highly erodible soils, a mess by the early 1930s. There was no soil conservation uh, agency yet, so they had to make it up. they really had to start from scratch and experiment. And so there's a technical side answer to your question of what they did, and then there's kind of the more social side. Technically, they began to do the sorts of things that we now know as common soil conservation techniques: contour plowing, strip cropping, grassed waterways, taking grazing off the steep slopes so it doesn't erode the soil in there, and they've been heavily grazed. The contour plowing is the one you notice visually, right? When you see that, you see those patterns on the land. There were experiments in doing that in other parts of the country, but to do it in a whole watershed with 400 and 500 farmers, that was unprecedented. So that's the social side of it. Not only did they have to have the technical skills and the soil scientists and foresters and wildlife ecologists and all that, they also had to figure out, how do you get 400 stubborn, independent Norwegian farmers to collaborate and work together for the betterment of their entire watershed. And I kind of joke about it because it is heavily Norwegian out there. But they did it. And that was the remarkable thing. So I highly encourage you to take a visit. There's not a planned tour or anything, but you can see it. And of course, there are watersheds, especially up there in the driftless area, that show the same techniques put into place. So that's a kind of a cursory answer. I'm not a soil conservationist by background, so others can give you better. But it's the same techniques that are being used now. But problem is that agriculture has changed so much. The machinery is so much larger. But that's why the driftless area of northeast Iowa and adjacent Wisconsin is so interesting, because you can't farm it the same way that you can in the big, open, flatter areas of Iowa or Illinois. So
I'd like to follow up. Did they
sure
reforested the valley, the gullies? Did they plant a lot of trees? That just happened naturally?
They if you look at some of the historic photos, you'll see what they're trying to do. They're trying to slow down the water and allow it to infiltrate. Right. The problem was that by the ways they were plowing for 2 generations out there, up and down the slopes, and not rotating crops, especially in the early years. Wisconsin was not a dairy state until well after settlement. So they were farming wheat. Imagine farming wheat on steep slopes. It's going to be a mess. So the whole point was to slow down the water, or as the current crop of younger farmers like to say, teaching running water. How's it go? Teaching running water to walk. To slow it down. So it's really putting in the terraces and strip crops and contours that would allow the infiltration of the water into the groundwater and to recharge the streams. The vegetation, there was some purposeful reforestation. Probably if we were doing it now, we would look more to getting more grass on the land, especially native prairie vegetation if we could. They weren't not thinking about that back then. But there was some reforestation, especially along the stream banks with willows and alders and other riparian vegetation. And of course, this leads right to another of Paul's key contributions, which was buffer strips. Right? Maybe many of you understand and know it and see it when you see it, the buffer strips, that was a passion of Paul's, and he did work at the national level that put, I don't know how the numbers are, but millions of linear miles of buffer strips across the streams of the country. And this came out of his experience in Iowa. So even then, back in the 30s, they were experimenting with revegetating the erodible stream sides of the driftless streams.
I see a question from Wendy. Is Jersey Valley County Park Lake part of that? The Coon Valley?
Ooh, I'm not familiar with that place name, so I'll have to do some Googling on that one.
Curt, there's also some remarks by Paula. in the chat saying thank you for making this presentation. She grew up in Wisconsin, so when she saw the Aldo Leopold name, she recognized it. And she is now in Sumner and looking for books to donate to her library. So she's really glad to learn about this book. And I think it's going to be acquired soon, it sounds like. Thank you, Paula, for your contribution.
Well, I should have said that all proceeds from sales of this book go directly back to the Johnson Center for Land Stewardship Policy. And let me just say 30 seconds about them. That after Paul died, his family, his legislative colleagues who were still with us, other colleagues of Paul's, it just felt strongly that something had to be done to kind of keep his ideas and work alive. So they created this small nonprofit. This book was very much a product of that. One of their goals was to do some publications that would keep Paul's writing, bring it together. So that was what I was asked to do. But the proceeds from the book are going to go back. And what the Johnson Center does is it's been devoted to a couple things, doing what I just described, the publications. It has a grant program for younger emerging leaders, scholarships. Most of them have gone to students, but there's not necessarily have to be a student, but they would like to continue to encourage younger people who are interested in these challenges and needs. They do public programming. We've done several live programs up in Decorah, and also a nice partnership with the Harkin Center in Des Moines. So there have been a number of programs and presentations, and they hope to do more of those. It's still a young, small organization and hoping to do more. And then particularly, they hope to be more involved in policy work in the future. But right now, it's one half-time employee and a bunch of really good people. I see a question about Coon Valley there by Wendy. Is there a book or report about how the watershed got started? Westby and Viroqua, yep, two of my favorite towns. There are. It would be a little difficult for me to punch them up right now. There are a number of YouTube videos you can watch if you just put in Coon Valley or Coon Creek watershed. Some of them very nice, actually. And you can also contact the NRCS office in Viroqua. They have a nice little, if you're ever going through that area, they have at least they did. I haven't been there in a while, but they used to have a really nice little historical display in their office in Viroqua that tells the story of the project.
Yeah. So just in case Norwegians out there, there's a book I just read. I don't know if it's bringing me backwards for what you're looking at, but How to Be Norwegian just came out. It's pretty fun. It's the ultimate guide to understanding life in Norway by a French person that lived there for 16 years. It's a good take with a lot of Norwegian words, so you can have fun. Well, unless we get any other comments, we're about an hour and a half here. I want to thank you all for being here and sharing your time with us, and especially to Curt. I think if we could all probably do on our cameras just a big round of applause for Curt for his time with us and expertise, and for forwarding the importance of conservation in our lives through his writings and speaking and remembrances of people that have made a difference in the past, and I hope we can too. So,
well, and I'll just say thank you all for inviting me and for sticking with this. But I know that all of you are doing good work every single day over there. Keep it up. Thank you for all you're doing.